Thanks to everyone joining us here today to talk about Toxic by Design, Understanding Coal Ash Pollution in Iowa. So as many of you might know, IEC has a new report out entitled Toxic by Design. It is now available on our website and includes contributions from nationwide experts and Iowa health professionals. The report examines the fundamentals of coal ash and its presence across Iowa, including the serious health and environmental risks associated with this hazardous waste. So the webinar today is intended to help others learn about coal ash and how it's impacted Iowa's environment and public health, and how IEC is working to protect communities from its dangers, especially as federal regulations are at risk of being rolled back. Today, we have three speakers with us. The first will be Mike Schmidt. Mike Schmidt is the General Counsel for the Iowa Environmental Council. He focuses on law and policy in each of the three areas of IEC's work: water, climate, and energy. Mike has a law degree from the University of Minnesota and a BA in political science from the University of Iowa. He previously worked for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy before coming to the Iowa Environmental Council in 2019. Our next speaker will be Rayhan Rashidi. She is the Energy Policy Manager at the Iowa Environmental Council, where she supports research and analysis, coalition building, and regulatory engagements on energy issues. Before graduate school, Rayhan contributed to IEC's grassroots campaigns to advance 24/7 carbon-free electricity across Iowa. She recently earned a Master of Public Administration with a focus on energy and the environment from Columbia University. And last but not least, Caroline Weinberg is a Senior Research and Policy Analyst at Earthjustice, where she offers technical support on a variety of issues related to clean energy deployment, grid decarbonization, and remediation of dirty power plant sites in the U.S. She tracks changes to and helps strengthen the federal regulation of coal ash. Please help me welcome our speakers today.
All right. The Iowa Environmental Council is the state's largest environmental coalition. We are a nonprofit member-based organization that works to advance public policies, and we work to provide a safe, healthy environment and sustainable future for all Iowans. Earthjustice is a nonprofit public interest law organization that wields the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, to preserve magnificent places and wildlife, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. So today we will talk about understanding coal ash and then talk about what that means in Iowa for Iowa's coal ash story. We will also cover health and environmental harms and risks, as well as the legal and regulatory approaches that have been taken in Iowa. Then we'll zoom out for a national landscape look at what is going on, and finally a call to action and opportunity for questions and answers. With that, I will turn it over to Rayhan to talk about understanding coal ash.
Thanks, Mike and Colleen. Hi, everyone. I'll be sharing the summary and findings of IEC's newly released report. I'll be talking about the fundamentals of coal ash, what it is and how it's regulated, how much of and where it is still left in Iowa to human health and environment. So coal ash, also known as coal combustion residual, is the toxic byproduct of burning coal for electricity. It is among the largest forms of industrial waste produced in the country by volume, and it consists of fly ash, bottom ash, boiler slag, and flue gas desulfurization materials, and each is produced in different stages of a coal power plant, as you can see in the top right photo on the slide. The physical and chemical characteristics of coal ash are influenced by various factors, such as the type of coal used, combustion techniques, as well as the pollution control technologies. In Iowa, subbituminous coal is a type of coal commonly used with average ash content of 5 to 19%. And this means that if a coal plant burns 1,000 tons of subbituminous coal, it can produce around 50 to 190 tons of coal ash. When it comes to combustion techniques, a pulverized coal boiler is typically used in Iowa, where it grinds coal into a fine powder that is then burned in a high temperature combustion chamber. It produces less coal ash compared to its counterpart, the fluidized bed combustion technology, where limestone is used to capture sulfur dioxide, which creates more coal ash. As for pollution control technologies, such as flue gas desulfurization scrubbers, total amount of coal ash can increase by up to 25%. And some coal plants in Iowa utilize these scrubbers, and while it keeps harmful particles out of the air, it generates more coal ash. If not safely stored and managed, this toxic component of coal waste can leach into the groundwater. In terms of storage, coal ash is stored in landfills and surface impoundments, which are also known as ash ponds, near the power plants. This makes it easier and more economical to transport the toxic waste. And for cooling purposes, these steam generating facilities are typically located near to or next bodies of water. And this unfortunately heightens the risk for coal ash leaching into the uppermost aquifers. Next slide, please. So there are two federal acts that govern coal ash, which are the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and the Clean Water Act, issued and enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. On the left side of the slide, the coal combustion residual, also known as CCR rule, is administered under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which focuses on solid waste and its storage and safety, as well as risk to groundwater. And it was first established in 2015, so a decade ago, and it was the first national regulation. It is the first national regulation of coal ash disposal that was primarily applied to active landfills and ash ponds. And it requires certain provisions such as groundwater monitoring, liner standards, and structural integrity assessments, as well as public disclosure and location restrictions. Last year, the EPA expanded this rule to include legacy disposal sites, which are basically landfills at old coal plants that retired before 2015. And given that most legacy sites are typically unlined, unmonitored, and structurally compromised, this step was key to reducing the risk of environmental harms. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see is the Effluent Limitation Guidelines, or ELG rule, and that's governed under the Clean Water Act. So this focuses on liquid discharges or wastewater into surface waters. And it was first established in the 1970s and had gone through several changes throughout the years, and most recently in 2024. And the amended rule sets stricter discharge limits on toxic pollutants from flue gas desulfurization wastewater, bottom ash transport water, combustion residual leachate, and legacy wastewaters, and requires best available technologies to treat these toxic pollutants. So to summarize the federal regulations, the CCR rule, its environmental concern is mainly the leaching of toxins into groundwater, while the ELG concerns direct pollution of rivers, lakes, wetlands, and other streams. The CCR rule has forced the closure of some ash ponds and landfills, although there is still risk of groundwater contamination if not stored and managed properly, as I mentioned earlier. The ELG rule has required treatment technology upgrades or retirement of older polluting coal plants. Both form a complementary framework to protect water from coal ash pollution, as one targets contamination at the source and the other targets pollution at the point of discharge. As many of you know, the current EPA administration is expected to make changes to several environmental regulations, including the CCR and ELG rules. There is likelihood in weakening these two rules, and Caroline will share more about that towards the end on what we're anticipating on the federal level. Next slide, please. So now we'll zoom more closely into Iowa. Building on the previous slide about coal ash regulation, Iowa Department of Natural Resources, or Iowa DNR, issues solid waste and wastewater permits related to CCR. The state agency enforces the federal ELG rule through its wastewater permits with EPA oversight. However, Iowa DNR does not have primary enforcement authority over the federal CCR rule. That responsibility remains with the EPA. While Iowa solid waste regulations align with many CCR rule provisions, the federal rule includes additional stricter requirements such as mandatory public posting of groundwater monitoring data to increase the transparency. So the analysis of our report mainly focuses on the CCR rule, and Mike will cover issues concerning the ELG rule in Iowa. From the report, we found that there are 69 known utility coal ash disposal sites that span across 16 counties, and 43 ash ponds and landfills are or should be regulated under the 2015 CCR rule, while 25 sites may be regulated under the 2024 legacy CCR rule. In terms of volume, there is an estimated 19 million cubic yards of coal ash stored in Iowa currently, which is enough toxic waste to fill the Mid-American Energy Field at Jack Trice Stadium in Ames nearly 90 times. The coal ash sites covered in this report, however, only represents just a portion of Iowa's coal ash problem. In addition to power plants, coal ash is also produced by non-utility sectors, including agricultural operations. Therefore, the threat of coal ash pollution in the state is even greater. From the 2024 groundwater monitoring data that the utilities publish on their websites, which is a requirement of the CCR rule, as mentioned earlier, 9 out of 12 coal plants contain coal ash contaminants that exceed federal health standards for contaminants such as arsenic, cadmium, selenium, and others. All of them are owned and operated by Iowa's largest utilities, which are Mid-American Energy and Interstate Power and Light. Some of their facilities have shown exceedances for many years, what is considered safe for drinking water. However, despite years of contamination, the utilities have mostly failed to take adequate cleanup measures. However, there are many criticisms of the groundwater monitoring process that are self-reported by qualified professional engineers hired by these CCR owners and operators. For instance, at George Neal North Monofill in Woodbury County, I want to point out a process called an alternate source demonstration, which is used to claim that exceedances come from a different source and not their coal ash sites. As a result, they're not required to conduct additional monitoring or corrective action. However, in an EPA nationwide review of CCR facilities that were seeking extensions of closure deadlines or approval of alternative liner designs, the EPA found that 43 out of 44 sites failed to prove that their pollution came from an alternative source. So this 98% failure rate shows that alternate source demonstration have become a loophole that lets polluters evade cleanup and responsibilities, while communities are left to bear the burden of these unchecked coal ash contaminations. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, coal ash contains heavy metals and toxic contaminants such as arsenic, lead, mercury, and cadmium, among others. And exposure to these substances can lead to serious health harms to different parts of the human body, including development disorders, various forms of cancer, and premature death. The figure on the right is developed by Earth Justice and demonstrates how various parts of the human body is impacted by different coal ash toxic contaminant. While cancer can result from many overlapping complex factors, I want to point out that environmental exposures play a significant role in its development. Notably, nearly 75% of coal plants with coal combustion residual disposal sites are located in counties with cancer rates above state average, in a state that already ranks second nationally for new cancer diagnosis. And these counties are Muscatine, Woodbury, Clay, Des Moines, Humboldt, Clinton, Wapello, Lynn, Scott, Black Hawk, and Marshall. Although research specifically linking coal ash to cancer is limited, strengthening the regulation and oversight of coal ash remains a critical and important step toward reducing environmental health risks. Additionally, more than 75% of Iowans rely on groundwater sources for drinking water, including up to 290,000 that have and use private wells. And this leaves many residents vulnerable to contamination from coal ash pollutants, with certain populations facing disproportionately higher health risk, including children, pregnant women, Indigenous communities, and cleanup workers. For example, I'll talk about Woodbury County, Iowa, which is home to 2 Mid-American Energy coal plants and several ash disposal sites. It has the highest percentage of Native American and Alaska Native residents in the state, which is at 17%. The Winnebago Reservation, primarily in Nebraska, extends into Woodbury County and lies just downstream of these plants and ash sites, and both located along the Missouri River. This river is vital to the community's drinking water, agriculture practices, as well as cultural and spiritual practices. Yet the Winnebago community faces layered environmental health inequities. Woodbury County is designated by the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services as a medically underserved area, and both cancer incidence and mortality rates exceed state averages, and access to health care remains limited. So these challenges are compounded also by a poverty rate among Native American and Alaska Native Iowans that is double the statewide average. So this further deepens the disparities between Indigenous communities and the broader population. Another group that I want to talk about is the coal ash cleanup workers who are involved in coal ash cleanup and face the highest risk of direct exposure to toxic heavy metals and radioactive materials contained in coal ash. So the largest industrial disaster by volume in the US is a coal ash spill in Kingston, Tennessee. And it required the hiring of roughly 900 cleanup workers. And unfortunately, as of earlier this year, over 50 deaths and more than 200 illnesses have been linked to prolonged exposure to coal ash contaminants among these workers. So as federal regulations mandate the cleanup or closure of coal ash sites that exceed water or health quality standards, it's essential to establish clear, enforceable protections for worker health and safety. And I want to point out that EPA's own risk assessment also shows that peak pollution from coal ash disposal sites may not occur until up to 100 years after the initial placement of the waste. This highlights the critical need for comprehensive closure, long-term post-closure management, and stricter enforcement. And even inactive sites can pose significant risk to human health and the environment for decades to come. Next page, please. So in addition to impacts on human health, coal ash continues to degrade our surrounding ecosystems. Beyond the contamination of groundwater from leaking disposal sites, direct discharges of polluted wastewater from coal ash facilities are a significant source of toxic pollution in our rivers and lakes. In fact, coal-fired power plants are the largest industrial contributors to water pollution by toxicity nationwide, releasing billions of pounds of contaminants into waterways. And this is often under the flawed assumption that dilution will minimize harm. Mike will share more about Iowa-specific cases that IEC and partners have addressed or are currently working on. So some coal ash toxins like arsenic, mercury, and selenium in fish are bioaccumulative, which means that the toxins build up and concentrate in organisms over time. And as these toxins move up the food chain, it poses serious health not only to humans that eat them, but also putting the aquatic species at risk, as high levels can deform or kill the fish. And finally, coal ash is frequently repurposed for a variety of uses, including in the construction of roads and bridges, as fill material, and even for landscaping and agricultural purposes. In Iowa alone, 200,000 tons of coal ash were reused in 2024. And this means that coal ash can end up in our everyday environments like playgrounds, parks, sidewalks, and near schools and hospitals. While labeled as beneficial reuse, this practice allows coal ash to be treated as a safe substitute for clean fill, despite containing toxic substances. And EPA's own risk assessment shows that even small amounts of coal ash mixed with clean surface soil can significantly raise the risk of cancer as well as other health harms. Rather than promoting safe containment or removal, beneficial reuse enables utilities to offload their coal ash without proper accountability and lack of regulation, contributing to long-term environmental degradation. And this approach really reflects a broader pattern of that prioritizes coal industry interests and enables the continued operation of outdated, polluting, and uneconomical coal-fired power plants, not just in Iowa, but also across the country. I'll hand it over to Mike.
All right, thanks, Rayhan. I want to highlight a few recent actions addressing coal ash waste in Iowa and what we have worked on related to them and what the outcome has been. So next slide. First, I want to provide the context that IEC and other environmental groups often review public notices, which are the legally required notices in fine print asking for public input that you might see in your local paper and just kind of glance over. In some cases, those notices are also sent by DNR via email. So we check those to make sure that we know what's going on. One that we found was a notice on behalf of MidAmerican from a consultant. MidAmerican has coal ash landfills near Sioux City, like Rayhan said, and they store waste from the George Neal coal plants just south of Sioux City. MidAmerican has had a process to evaporate leachate, which is the liquid that has kind of sifted through or percolated through the coal ash and goes to the bottom of the coal ash landfill. They had a process to evaporate that, but sometimes there was too much leachate. So their proposed solution was to dump it into the river. Next slide. The problem with dumping it into the river is that, as Rayhan mentioned, leachate contains toxic metals, things like arsenic and mercury. In fact, there's a long list of chemicals that MidAmerican's monitoring had found in the leachate. We put out action alerts and hundreds of people commented that just sending this directly into the river is not the right approach. Ultimately, after those comments, MidAmerican chose not to move ahead with the proposed discharge. Next slide. Interestingly, Alliant Energy has similar leachate that it produces. And in 2024, Alliant, which is the parent company of Interstate Power and Light, the Iowa subsidiary, they proposed that from the Ottumwa landfill, they should discharge the leachate into the Des Moines River. This might sound a little bit familiar. Next slide. Once again, the leachate has lots of chemicals in it, arsenic, cobalt, other metals. Once again, we made comments along with supporters, and once again, the utility decided maybe we should not just dump this directly into the river without any treatment. Next slide. The other thing that the coal ash landfill has produced is called underdrain water. So at this landfill, the water table was high enough that it needed to be lowered to be able to construct the landfill. Lowering the water table means that on a pretty continual basis, water is flowing toward this site and it has to be pumped out. Unfortunately, that water is not all that clean. It has some of the same kinds of contaminants as the coal ash leachate. With some partners, the Environmental Law and Policy Center and Sierra Club, we sent a 60-day notice of intent to sue under the Clean Water Act because that discharge with pollution that was being pumped out did not have a permit. We said in this 60-day notice letter. At the end of the 60 days, Alliant agreed to stop the discharge without admitting that there was any violation, and instead it is directing water to the City of Ottumwa wastewater treatment facility, or it might send it to the Ottumwa coal plant. That transfer by truck is really a temporary solution, not a permanent solution. So in the long term, they may still redirect it to the Des Moines River, but we are kind of waiting on what that long-term solution will look like. Next slide. The other issue is that at that same Ottumwa coal ash landfill site, there's a permit for discharge from the coal plant, but not one for the leachate from the coal ash landfill. We pointed out that those 2024 federal regulations that Rehan went through, they require zero discharge of coal ash leachate. Right now, the utility is sending that leachate to the City of Ottumwa, and the city is discharging it, but neither Alliance permit nor the city permit is adopting those federal limits that were adopted last year. And so we have commented on the permit, told DNR those limits have to be incorporated into these discharge permits. And in response to those comments, DNR has announced that it will hold a public hearing. We don't know exactly when that will be, but that should be coming up. And at that public hearing, we intend to highlight that Iowans have a right to clean water. We have plenty of other water quality problems to deal with. And the utilities can't avoid responsibility by trying to transfer the waste with heavy metals to the city and make the city pay for it. So those are some of the recent actions that we've seen on coal ash and utilities trying to discharge it in Iowa. With that, I will turn to Caroline for the national landscape and outlook.
Thanks so much. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and thank Iowa Environmental Council for taking such a deep dive on this issue in the most recent report. As mentioned before, I work for Earthjustice, and we really deeply engage on coal ash regulation at the federal level. So thinking about where these units are across the whole nation and how federal EPA is dealing with their regulation. So I'm looking forward to kind of walking through that national landscape and how it's changing with you all today in the next several slides. So the next slide, I know this graph is a little complicated and we'll work through it together. But I wanted to just talk about how many of these units we're talking about. You know, Rehan really laid it out earlier, the kind of Iowa picture of 69 units in the state and 25 of those being regulated under this 2024 version of the rule. So let's start on the left-hand side of this graphic. As Rehan mentioned, federal regulation of coal ash began in 2015, but exempted various categories of units. And an important thing to know about the way that the federal coal ash rule works is that it's so-called self-implementing. And what that means is that it's the coal utility's responsibility to identify that they have coal ash units that are subject to these rules, create a website where they then publicly post documents about how many units they have, how much ash they contain, the extent to which they're contaminating groundwater, and their cleanup process if groundwater contamination is found, which it almost always is. And so those coal utilities under the 2015 version of the rule documented around 750 units that were regulated under the 2015 rule across the whole nation. I say about 750 because over time, the way they parse up units can change, but it's around 750. And actually, we think they're based on Earthjustice review of publicly available information. We believe that there are probably 40 or so more that are actually subject to the 2015 version of the rule, but where coal utilities that own and operate those units just never created a public website. And there are several ponds like that in Iowa, which you can find information about in the report that IUC has put together. And so shifting towards the right-hand side of this graphic, what these two additional bands are showing is everything that was exempted under the 2015 version of the rule that, you know, after various lawsuits and back and forth with EPA, there's a really great final rule put out in May of last year that expanded coverage to a lot of different types of units. And they're parsed up in some confusing ways, but generally what to know about these units is that they weren't receiving waste after 2015. But we know that even if it didn't receive waste after 2015, these landfills, ponds still contain the exact types of material that can contaminate groundwater and actually have been doing it for a longer time if they're older and might be getting close to that kind of peak contamination mark that Rehan mentioned earlier. And as Rehan mentioned, there are about 25 units like this that we estimate in Iowa. At the national level, there are over 900 of these units, as you can see in the graph here. And as I mentioned, they're kind of parsed up into different categories. But one thing that's worth remembering as we go through the next slide is that that yellow band represents so-called legacy ponds. And the red band, which is much larger, represents what are called CCR management units or CCRMU. This is basically dry ash dumps that had ceased receiving waste around 2015. So we can go to the next slide. As everyone on this call knows, the administration changed in 2025. And the administration we have now is not as interested in the federal regulation of coal ash in a stringent way in the same way that the previous administration was. And so I'm going to walk through kind of what we've seen over the past several months and what that might mean going forward as we think about the way that coal ash is regulated on the national level and really trying to fight for communities to be protected from the pollution that can leak from these units, whether they were receiving ash after 2015 or not. And so I'm going to walk through various kind of snapshots of different letters and EPA press releases, so bear with me, and hopefully this is somewhat legible to you all. But at the very beginning of the year in January, we saw a letter from various coal utilities that essentially put a wish list together to the administration, the administrator of the EPA. And one of the things that they focused on was immediate action needed for an overhaul of CCR regulations. And this is essentially a wish list that they put together of the way that CCR regulation could be weakened. And they asked for lots of things in this letter. But one thing that's worth noting is a lot of their asks surrounded that red band that I was focusing on before, over 700 units of so-called CCRMU that are newly regulated under the 2024 rule. Another thing that they asked for, these coal industries or coal utilities asked for, is for states to have, for EPA to basically shift oversight to the states to enforce the CCR rule. As Rayhan explained earlier, at least in Iowa, some of those permitting programs for solid waste are less stringent than the federal rule. And as Mike just walked through, you know, those leachate issues were things that the public had to get involved in. They were not things that DNR was enforcing on its own. So we can see how this might be a challenge to have states running a CCR oversight program rather than something more stringent at the federal level. We can go to the next bullet point. In March of 2025, EPA released a press release. You don't have to read all of this, but just focusing on 2 points where they announced that they were going to prioritize state permit programs, and also they were going to grant short and long-term relief, such as extending compliance deadlines. And when we talk about compliance deadlines, this relates to the kind of self-implementing nature of the rule that I was talking about before, where coal utilities are given certain timelines on which they have to start reporting on their coal ash units, and that the results of that reporting and monitoring then triggers cleanup, etc. And so by extending the timelines, really what they're extending is how long this pollution can continue to be released without industry having to do anything to clean it up. And so what we saw in this EPA press release in March is that they're starting to take actions that are in line with the wish list that the coal utilities had put together at the beginning of the year. And then in April, next bullet point, we saw a letter from USWAG, which is a group, again, of utilities, where they specifically lay out their desires for extended compliance deadlines specific to CCR management units, or CCRMU, that kind of group of over 700 units that we predict are covered under the 2024 rule, and that right now we have very little information about. And, you know, cleanup of these units that are older and had ceased receiving waste prior to 2015 is really urgently needed. And the utilities are hoping to get this deadline extended. Next slide. Lo and behold, kind of breaking news just last week, EPA took their first regulatory action to extend these deadlines. And this is kind of the first major action that the new administration has taken on coal ash. That they also approved North Dakota's permitting program that happened, or issued a draft approval or proposed approval, and that happened a couple of months ago. This is the first action that they've taken on the federal rule itself. And they have proposed to extend those compliance deadlines. And there is a worry that this extension of deadlines, what will happen, not only will that contamination continue to pollute groundwater around those units for longer than it would have if they had been compelled to clean up on the initial timelines, which were already very, very generous. There's also a worry that in the time that they've granted for industry to kind of be able to sit back, this new administration might rewrite the rules to make the definition of what counts as a CCRMU much smaller, might take the definition away completely. And so this is what we're fighting. There's a comment period open on this most recent action through August 21st, and we will be issuing comments to discuss why this extension is totally not supported by the information that EPA has received. And also, we're going to continue to fight any proposed rollbacks to the rule. We know that the coal industry has to be mandated to account for, publicly show any pollution that is being released from the coal ash units that they manage, and also to create meaningful cleanup plans for those units. And the federal rules offer a way to do that. That's really accounts for a substantial amount of the coal ash that we think has been released throughout the nation, especially with this expansion of the rule that occurred last year. And we'll be fighting to keep these rules as strong as possible in an administration that has shown that they are, willing to comply with industry demands for weakening the rules in various ways. So that's where we are right now at the federal level, and I appreciate the chance to kind of opine on federal coal ash regulation, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that folks may have.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for that thorough walkthrough of just the timeline of what the EPA is thinking about federally on CCR rules. I really want to highlight the work that Earthjustice has been doing for more than 15 years on advocating for strict enforcing the regulations to make sure that public health and the environment are prioritized. And thank you so much, Caroline, for the work that you're doing and for giving us that overview. And now I want to kind of end the, before we go into Q&A, talk a little bit about some call to action, bringing some of the awareness to action and talk about like several meaningful ways that the public can take on this issue. Next slide, please. So firstly, I want to briefly mention that simply by spreading the word helps, by attending this webinar helps a lot. Sharing what you've learned today with your friends, family, and colleagues can go a long way, including sharing IEC's report as well as the recording of this webinar that we'll send out in the coming days. So another important step is to contact Iowa DNR. I think things that you are able to do using the action items listed on the slide. So Iowa has a program that offers accessible water testing resources for contaminants, including those that are found in coal ash, such as arsenic and manganese. So you can reach out to the DNR staff listed on the right or your local county environmental health office to learn more, and we will share that resource with you in the chat. You can also urge the DNR to enforce timely and effective corrective actions at contaminated sites and to hold the facility owners and operators accountable through penalties for noncompliance. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, there are currently no clear regulatory health and safety standards for workers handling coal ash. So calling for such protections, I think, is very critical to protect environmental and public health. Lastly, as Mike mentioned, a public hearing is expected soon for the Ottumwa wastewater permit, and our partners at Sierra Club have prepared helpful talking points to support community participation, and we will also be sharing that in the chat as well as the follow-up email to attendees and registrants. We'll be sharing those resources and additional hearing details as soon as they become available. So with that, I pass it back to Colleen. Thank you.
Thanks, Rayhan. Thank you, Caroline, Rayhan, and Mike for that overview of coal ash and how it impacts Iowa and what we can do going forwards. Let's see, I'm going to stop sharing so we can jump over to the Q&A. See if we have questions there. Just a quick note, we will be posting this webinar, as Rayhan mentioned, within the week, so that if you missed any of this section of our presentation today, you can refer back to that webinar. We have a couple questions coming in here. One of them says, I'm curious about the reuse of coal ash. And Rayhan, I believe you had mentioned that. How do you see the use of coal ash if if it's not best practice to reuse it? What's the option instead?
Thanks for that question. I think it's very important first to, if we were to allow what we are allowing the beneficial reuse for several uses, there's no clear regulation that has that clear guideline of how much, what the limits are for those coal ash and the contaminants that come with it. So I think that's firstly is important to make clear. And the other thing is, having a lot of, we in Iowa, there's still coal plants that are operating, and with that comes more coal ash that will continue to be produced and stored in these coal plants, and potentially be used for repurposing. So it's very important to essentially look into retiring these coal plants and looking into other ways for us to be able to generate electricity in a cleaner way for not just public health, the environment, as we mentioned earlier.
I can
Rayhan.
speak briefly to the reuse question as well. Not at all representing, IEC's approach to this, but at Earthjustice, one thing we talk about is that the coal ash is actually not that hard to store safely if you can keep it away from water as a dry material. It's pretty easy to store safely and can be used, reused in encapsulated, so-called types of encapsulated reuse, whereas Rayhan talked a lot about unencapsulated reuse, where it's used as a replacement for soil, where it's really just placed on the ground, can get rained on, can release metals into the environment, just as other storage sites can. But types of encapsulated reuse involve incorporating it into cement, for example, or other construction products, where the heavy metals are effectively immobilized in that solid product and kept away from, ways that it can leach out. And that is a way to reuse this material that's protective of human health and the environment. The problem is that there are lots of ways that industry likes to claim they are beneficially reusing the coal ash that aren't actually protective of human health and the environment.
Do we have information in Iowa on how that reuse is currently being done? Do we have some safe methods and unsafe methods happening in Iowa?
So
Is it being mixed into soil in Iowa, or is it being reused in other ways?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the way we analyze this information is through the utilities annual engineering report or solid byproduct management plan. I think that's what it's called. That's publicly available in the Iowa DNR database, and they have to disclose what the beneficial reuse of coal ash is used for. So some of them are, being used for construction use, and some are used for soil stabilization. So in the 2024 report, most of them are used for construction uses. However, I've seen earlier reports in 2022, 2023 that's been used for soil stabilization. So there are those distinctions that they have to disclose.
And just a quick note too, a reminder in the chat, there's a link to our full report, so you can get some more information on that in our full report. The next question is for Caroline. Caroline, you mentioned that the recent EPA extension of CCR deadlines is to February of 2027. What were the original deadlines?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is that the original final deadlines were the beginning of 2026, so February of 2026, and this recent EPA action is essentially pushing it back a year. The slightly longer answer is that in the proposed rule, EPA had even shorter compliance deadlines that we thought were appropriate, which would have involved us already having information from industry about these CCR units. And in response to industry comments on the proposed rule, EPA has already pushed back the deadlines, such that the final rule had much longer deadlines than the proposed rule. So this kind of second pushing back of the deadlines really doesn't have much support.
Caroline? We have a couple more minutes for questions here. If there's any other ones you want to type into the chat. Otherwise, if you think of a question later on, all of our staff members, Rayhan, Michael, and Caroline would be happy to answer your questions after the fact via email. All right, we had one other question added here. Do coal ash ponds pose any risk of windswept pollution danger to waterfowl?
I can respond briefly. I haven't looked into impacts on waterfowl or other plants or animals specifically, but certainly there has been study of so-called fugitive dust, or if ash units aren't kind of properly, if the dust that can blow off of them is not properly mitigated, that can pose a threat to human health of folks living nearby because of inhaling or ingesting some of that particulate matter. Again, haven't seen studies specific to ecological receptors, but yeah, if you search around for coal ash and fugitive dust, you might find something there.
Caroline? Well, it looks like that's the conclusion of our Q&A section today. So I just want to take a minute once again to thank you all for being here and joining us. Look for the webinar to be posted on our website. And then there's also a link in the chat. If you're interested in some of our other upcoming webinars, you can click there and read the descriptions and get signed up, and we'll hope to see you again on another webinar soon.